The summer of 1983 clung to Brighton like a second skin, a relentless heat that shimmered off sun-baked asphalt and radiated from the glass fronts of the promenade shops. Inside Neptune's arcade, the air conditioner struggled, humming a losing battle against the collective heat of 100 flashing screens and the rhythmic, electronic thrum of Space Invaders and Pac-Man. Liam, 19, moved through it all with the practiced ease of someone who knew every sticky button and every temperamental joystick. He smelled perpetually of stale chips, ozone, and the salty tang of the North Sea that seeped in through the open doors, a scent clinging stubbornly to the threadbare apron tied around his waist. His hands, usually stained with the grease of a faulty coin mechanism or the faint metallic tang of old 10-pence pieces, found themselves tracing idle patterns on the condensation of a cold glass bottle of Coke, the condensation forming tiny rivers down the green glass. He'd stare at the fizzing bubbles, listening to the cacophony around him, and in his mind, he'd hear guitar riffs that never quite formed, half-baked melodies that were always just out of reach. He watched the holidaymakers, their laughter echoing against the glass, their faces bright with the fleeting joy of a week by the sea. They were like colorful, ephemeral creatures, passing through his gray-tinted world, and he felt an ache for something more, something undefined that lay beyond the familiar horizon of his daily grind, beyond the gray stretch of the channel. It was a dull, constant throb beneath the surface, a yearning he rarely articulated, even to himself. Then Sarah walked in. The sudden downpour had sent a scattering of people ducking for cover, and she was one of them, shaking droplets from her sun-streaked brown hair as she stepped inside. She was a year younger than him, maybe 18, and the crisp, pale blue apron she wore over a simple cotton dress seemed impossibly clean, a stark contrast to his own grease-stained uniform. Her hair, usually tied back with a simple ribbon he would later learn was momentarily loose, framing a face that held a quiet intensity. Her eyes, the color of warm honey, scanned the noisy arcade with a flicker of curiosity before settling on him behind the counter. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the electronic chatter. "Do you have change for a 10-pence piece?" He nodded, pushing a handful of smaller coins across the counter. Her fingers, slender and unblemished, picked up the change, and he noticed a paperback clutched in her other hand, its cover worn from obvious reading. She didn't leave immediately, lingering near the flashing lights of a Space Invaders machine, the rain still drumming against the pier outside. He found himself watching her, a strange pull drawing his gaze. She looked up, caught his eye, and offered a small, hesitant smile. "Nasty downpour, isn't it?" she commented, gesturing vaguely towards the obscured windows. "Comes out of nowhere, sometimes," he agreed, leaning against the counter, suddenly aware of the faint smell of stale chips clinging to his shirt. "At least it'll clear up the air a bit." She nodded, then glanced at the book in her hand. "I was just getting to a good part." "What's that, then?" he asked, genuinely curious. Most kids her age were more interested in pop magazines than paperbacks. She held it up slightly. "It's a collection of short stories. By Alice Munro." Her eyes, when they met his again, held that quiet intensity, a depth that surprised him. They talked, first about the sudden rain, then about the book, about other books, then about everything and nothing at all. He found himself laughing more easily than he had in years, a genuine, unforced sound that felt unfamiliar on his own ears. She, in turn, seemed to shed a layer of polite reserve, her initial shyness giving way to a quick wit and a thoughtful gaze that made him feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in a long time. It was as if a dusty window in his mind had been wiped clean, revealing a new clarity. Their connection was immediate, a spark igniting in the humid, electric air of the arcade, crackling quietly beneath the din of the machines. After their shifts, when the arcade was finally quiet and the bookshop 2 streets back had locked its doors, they would meet. The air would be cooler then, carrying the sharper tang of the sea. They walked along the pebbled beach as the sun dipped, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges, the colors bleeding into the horizon. They'd shared cheap cider from a brown paper bag, the taste tart and sweet on their tongues, and talk for hours. Liam spoke of his half-formed dreams, of moving to London, of playing in a band that actually mattered, of writing songs that people might remember, songs that said something true. He'd never voiced these things out loud before, not really, and hearing them echo in the salt-laced air made them feel almost tangible. Sarah, in turn, confided her own aspirations. She spoke of university, of a life beyond the quiet seaside town, perhaps a career in publishing, surrounded by words and ideas that could shape worlds. She spoke with a quiet passion that made her eyes shine in the fading light. He listened, captivated, feeling a strange blend of admiration and a pang of something he couldn't quite name, a subtle awareness of the different paths their lives were taking. They kissed for the first time under the flickering lights of the pier, the salty wind whipping around them, tasting of cider and sea. It was a tentative, breathless moment, a question and an answer, a promise hanging unspoken in the air between them, fragile and potent. Their summer became a montage of stolen moments, each one precious and fleeting. A shared ice cream cone melting too fast, the sticky sweetness on their lips as they laughed, trying to catch the drips. Late-night walks where their hands brushed, then intertwined, fingers locking naturally as if they had always belonged together. The thrill of secret rendezvous in deserted alleys behind the tourist shops, their whispers lost to the roar of the waves, their breath mingling in the cool night air. It felt like an eternity, a world unto itself, suspended between the ordinary rhythms of their daily lives and the extraordinary newness of their connection. Every touch, every glance, every shared silence deepened the bond, weaving them into a tapestry of shared experience. But as August drew to a close, so too did their idyll. Sarah was heading north for university, a scholarship secured, a future laid out in neat, academic terms. Liam's family needed him. His dad's factory hours had been cut, leaving a gaping hole in their household income, and his younger sister was just starting secondary school, needing new uniforms and books. He couldn't leave. The air in the Hope and Anchor seemed to thicken around them, heavy with the scent of stale beer and forgotten ambition. Liam had taken a half-step forward, his hand still resting on the bar, as if ready to retreat at any moment. Sarah, across the smoky room, felt her polite smile falter, replaced by a tremor that started in her stomach and spread upwards. Dave's synth-pop group droned on, a tinny, unwelcome soundtrack to the sudden, jarring collision of their past and present. Liam, she managed again, her voice still barely a whisper, but this time, it felt like a question, an appeal. He nodded, a wry, almost shy smile finally touching his lips, the faint scar above his left eyebrow catching the dim light. Sarah, well, I'll be damned. His voice was deeper than she remembered, rougher, like gravel shifting underfoot, but the underlying timbre was undeniably his. He pushed off the bar completely then, navigating a path through the sparse crowd with a familiar, easy grace she'd once known so well. When he reached her, they stood a foot apart, an invisible barrier humming between them. Her work colleague, a man named Jeremy, cleared his throat awkwardly beside her, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere. Sarah offered a hurried, almost breathless introduction. Liam, this is Jeremy. Jeremy, an old friend. The word friend felt inadequate, a flimsy cover for the earthquake rumbling beneath her feet. Jeremy, bless his oblivious heart, mumbled a pleasantry and then, sensing the deep current of history, made a swift exit to freshen his drink. Silence descended, more profound than the pub noise. Liam's gaze, those intense, restless eyes she remembered, swept over her, taking in her tailored suit, the pearl earrings, the careful set of her hair. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, surprise, perhaps a hint of admiration, or maybe even a touch of something akin to disappointment. You're in London, then? He asked, the question feeling both obvious and loaded. Yes, she replied, a little too quickly. For a while now. 2 years after I left. She watched his eyes, searching for a reaction, but his expression remained carefully neutral. Right, he said, a brief nod. He gestured vaguely towards the stage. Still playing music? The question hung in the air, a ghost of their shared dreams. He gave a short, humorless laugh that barely reached his eyes. Not really. Construction, mostly, he shrugged, a gesture that spoke volumes of resignation. Been at it a few years now. Pays the rent, you know. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press, sensing the raw edge beneath the casual tone. Her gaze drifted, almost unconsciously, to the engagement ring on her finger. The diamond, modest but respectable, seemed to suddenly gleam with an unbearable brightness. She felt an urge to hide it, then a stronger one to assert its presence, a small, glittering shield against the tide of memory threatening to overwhelm her. I'm getting married next spring, she said, the words feeling foreign and heavy on her tongue. To Mark. His smile, which had been tentative, faltered. Just for a second, a shadow passed over his eyes, a brief, almost imperceptible tightening around his mouth. It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a forced geniality. Right. Congratulations, then. The words were polite, perfectly pitched, but they felt like sharp little pebbles rattling in a tin can. The air grew thick, suddenly oppressive, with unspoken history, the weight of their divergent lives pressing down on them both. They talked about the weather, about how terrible Dave's band sounded, about anything to avoid the elephant in the room, the bright, beautiful summer they'd shared, and the silent, inexplicable way it had ended. He asked about her work, and she gave him a sanitized version of her PR career, leaving out the tedious clients and the quiet sense of unfulfillment. She asked about his flat, and he merely grunted, mentioning Islington and, a bit of a dive, but it's mine. When the work function wound down, and Jeremy reappeared to gather her, Liam surprised her by pulling a crumpled beer mat from his pocket and a stubby pencil. Your number? He asked, his gaze steady, almost challenging. She hesitated, her heart thumping against her ribs. Every sensible fiber of her being screamed no. But then, she found herself nodding, a part of her surprised by her own willingness, by the sudden, reckless impulse that had been dormant for so long. She recited the numbers, watching him scribble them down with a calloused thumb, his brow furrowed in concentration. Don't call too late, she added, an afterthought, a futile attempt to regain some control. He just nodded, tucking the mat into his pocket. A few days later, the phone rang in her Wimbledon flat. It was a Thursday evening, Mark was out at his squash club, and the silence of the flat was usually a comfort. Tonight, it felt hollow. She answered, expecting her mother or a colleague. Sarah? His voice, rougher than she remembered, sent a strange, electric jolt through her, a warmth spreading through her chest she hadn't felt in years. Liam, she breathed, her hand tightening on the receiver. They spoke for a few minutes, the conversation less strained than in the pub, but still circling around the edges of what they truly wanted to say. He suggested coffee. Somewhere neutral, he'd said, and she'd agreed, almost too readily. The cafe he picked was a greasy spoon near her office, a place she'd never have dared to step into on her own. The clatter of plates, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the pervasive smell of fried bacon and cheap coffee were a stark contrast to the hushed, polished world of her PR firm. She sat opposite him, her tailored coat draped carefully over the back of her chair, feeling conspicuously out of place. The small formica table between them felt like a vast ocean, separating two different continents. This time, the conversation flowed a little more easily, the anonymity of the cafe a strange kind of liberation. He spoke of his struggles, the grind of manual labor, the aching muscles, the perpetual dust clinging to everything. It's not exactly the rock star life I had planned, is it? He said, a bitter laugh escaping him. He talked about the quiet despair of dreams deferred, the way the city swallowed up ambition, leaving behind only the need for survival. He looked tired, she noticed, the lines around his eyes deeper, but there was still that spark, that restless energy in his gaze, even as he spoke of defeat. She, in turn, found herself confessing the subtle emptiness beneath her successful exterior, the feeling of having followed a script rather than her own desires. She spoke of the relentless pressure, the careful performance of corporate communication, the stifling predictability of her trajectory. "It's all correct," she said, stirring her lukewarm tea, avoiding his eyes. "Everything I was told I should want. But sometimes, it feels like I'm watching someone else live my life." She didn't mention Mark much, deflecting his polite inquiries about her fiancé with vague smiles and quick changes of subject. She felt a prickle of guilt, but the words wouldn't form. They started meeting regularly, stolen hours during lunch breaks, or late evenings after work, always in places that felt anonymous, away from their respective lives. A walk through St. James's Park, the crisp autumn air biting at their cheeks, their breath visible in small clouds, the rustle of fallen leaves underfoot. They walked in comfortable silences, sometimes, the city sounds a distant hum, the old familiarity seeping back in. Other times, they talked for hours, about everything and nothing. A quiet drink in a forgotten pub in Southwark, tucked away down a cobbled alley. The dim light, the worn velvet seats, the murmur of other conversations, all provided a backdrop for their unfolding reconnection. Each meeting peeled back another layer of the years, revealing the people they had become, scarred and shaped by life, and the echoes of the people they once were, still stubbornly present. Sarah found herself drawn to Liam's raw honesty, his still-present vulnerability beneath the hardened exterior. He'd talk about a particularly frustrating day at the site, or a song he'd heard that reminded him of their youth, and she'd see glimpses of the passionate boy she'd known, a flicker of the fire that had once burned so brightly. His hands, rough and calloused from work, seemed to hold a quiet strength that both intimidated and comforted her. He, in turn, saw past her professional polish to the thoughtful, questioning girl he remembered, a spark in her eyes that reminded him of endless summer nights spent talking under starry skies. He saw the way she'd chew on her lip when she was deep in thought, the slight tilt of her head when she was truly listening. The corporate veneer cracked, revealing the sensitive, intelligent woman beneath. The old feelings, dormant for so long, began to stir, a dangerous warmth spreading through them both. It was subtle at first, a casual touch of hands over a coffee cup that lingered a moment too long, a brief, electric current passing between them before they pulled away, feigning nonchalance. A shared glance across a crowded room, held just a fraction longer than necessary, conveyed more meaning than 1,000 spoken words. Sarah felt a thrill, a vividness she hadn't realized was so profoundly missing from her carefully constructed life. With Liam, the world seemed to sharpen, colors brighter, sounds clearer, her own emotions more immediate and real. Liam felt a resurfacing of hope, a belief that perhaps not all his dreams were dead, that there was still a possibility for something more than the endless grind. He found himself looking forward to their meetings with a desperate anticipation he hadn't felt in years. The tension between them grew, a silent current pulling them closer, an unspoken question hanging in the autumn air. It was a delicious, terrifying feeling, a dangerous dance on the edge of a precipice, with the weight of 5 years and 2 entirely separate lives pressing down, and the ghost of a shared past whispering promises they both knew they shouldn't listen to. The weight of that moment on the South Bank hung heavy between them for days, a quiet, insistent hum beneath the surface of their separate lives. Sarah returned home to Mark, to the comfortable familiarity of their flat in Islington, but the air inside seemed to have grown thinner, the silence between them louder than any conversation. The future, once a clear path laid out before her, now felt opaque, shrouded in a fog she couldn't quite penetrate. She looked at her engagement ring, the diamond glinting under the kitchen light, no longer a symbol of security or a cherished promise, but a tether, binding her to a life that had begun to feel less like a choice and more like an obligation. Her movements around the flat became more deliberate, her gaze often drifting out the window, lost in thought. Mark, sensing a shift, though perhaps not understanding its depth, would sometimes reach for her hand, a gesture she would meet with a gentle, distant squeeze. Liam, meanwhile, found himself restless. The drone of the construction site, the rhythmic clang of his hammer against metal, felt duller, more pointless than ever before. The memory of Sarah's head against his chest, the faint, sweet scent of her hair, the quiet confession in her voice. It had reawakened something vital within him, a long-dormant part of his soul that now demanded attention. During his lunch breaks, he started carrying a small, dog-eared notebook again, the kind he used to fill in the long-gone days of his youth. He scribbled down fragmented song lyrics, half-formed melodies echoing in his mind, his fingers drumming rhythms on his knee, sometimes against the rough wood of the picnic bench, sometimes on the grimy metal of a toolbox. He'd catch himself humming, then stop, a slight flush rising on his neck, as if caught doing something illicit. The music, once a source of bitter disappointment, now felt like a fragile, hopeful secret. A week before Christmas, the phone rang in Liam's small, slightly damp flat in Kentish Town. He answered, a grunt of "hello" in his voice, expecting his sister or a mate from the site. Instead, it was Sarah. Her voice was steady, carefully modulated, but Liam, who knew her better than almost anyone, could hear the tremor beneath it. A faint vibration of nerves and something else he couldn't quite name. "Liam," she began, a pause stretching between them, thick with unspoken meaning. "I need to see you. One last time, before everything changes." His own heart gave a heavy thud, a sudden, sharp beat against his ribs. He gripped the receiver tighter. "All right, Sarah, where?" They chose a small, unassuming pub in a quiet corner of Bloomsbury, a place that felt deliberately removed from the glitz and forced cheer of the festive season. The air inside was warm, smelling of wood smoke and stale beer, a comforting, unpretentious scent that instantly took the edge off the biting December chill. They found a secluded booth tucked away in the back, the low light from a single dusty lamp casting long, shifting shadows around them. The red velvet upholstery was worn smooth in places, and the table bore the rings of countless forgotten pints. Sarah took a deep, visible breath, her hands clasped tightly on the table before her, her knuckles white. She looked at him, her eyes wide, searching. "I told Mark," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, the words seeming to hang in the air, fragile and momentous. Liam looked at her, his expression unreadable, a carefully constructed mask. He felt a sudden, sharp lurch in his stomach, a mixture of anticipation and dread. He didn't speak, just waited, his gaze fixed on her. "I told him I couldn't marry him," she continued, the words gaining a little strength now, though her voice still trembled. "That it wasn't fair to either of us. That I needed to figure things out for myself." A wave of relief, potent and overwhelming, washed over Liam, quickly followed by a sharp, unexpected pang of guilt for Mark, for the pain she had undoubtedly caused. He imagined the scene, the quiet devastation, the questions, the unspoken accusations. "Sarah," he started, his voice rough, unsure what to say, what he was even allowed to feel. She held up a hand, a small, decisive gesture that stopped him. "It's not about you, Liam." "Not entirely." Her gaze, so full of quiet intensity, met his, holding it. "Seeing you again. It just made me realize how much I'd lost touch with myself. With what I truly wanted. I was living a life I thought I should live, not when I wanted to live." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, tinged with a deep sadness. "But seeing you, seeing the dreams we shared, it reminded me of that other person. The one who wasn't afraid to want more. The one who believed in a different kind of future." Liam felt a profound shift within him, a subtle but undeniable realignment of his own internal landscape. It wasn't just about rekindling a past romance, a fleeting summer fling. It was about the profound, almost elemental impact they had on each other, then and now. They were catalysts for each other's truths. "I feel it too," he admitted, his voice rough, a confession torn from a place he hadn't known still existed. "That summer. It was the last time I truly felt like I knew who I was, what I wanted. Before everything got complicated. Before I got scared." He paused, taking a slow, deep breath, the stale pub air suddenly tasting clean, invigorating. Then he continued, a new resolve hardening the edges of his voice, making it steadier. "I'm not going to keep swinging a hammer forever. I'm going back to night school in January, for writing. And I'm going to start playing music again, properly. Even if it's just for myself, for now. Even if it never goes anywhere. He watched her face for a reaction, a flicker of doubt, but found only understanding, a quiet nod. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their individual decisions filling the space between them, not suffocating, but resonant. The past, the summer of 1983, was a beautiful, powerful memory, a foundation, a spark, but it was not their present. They were different people, shaped by 5 years of separate struggles and triumphs, of quiet compromises and growing pains. They couldn't simply pick up where they had left off, two carefree kids on a pier. That was a fantasy they both knew better than to chase. So, what now? Liam finally asked, his gaze tender, seeking hers, a question that held both hope and a deep, quiet trepidation. Sarah offered a small, tentative smile, a fragile bloom in the dim light. Now, we figure it out. She paused, her eyes flickering to his, then away, then back again. Separately, for a while. And then, maybe we see if there's a new us to discover. Not the kids from the pier, but the people we are now, with all our scars and our stories. All the things we've learned and lost. She reached across the worn table, her hand resting lightly on his, a feather-light touch that sent a jolt through him. Her touch was warm, reassuring, a promise not of an easy fairy tale, but of a real, honest connection, one built on shared understanding and a hard-won clarity. Liam squeezed her hand gently, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I like the sound of that," he said, a genuine smile finally reaching his eyes, crinkling the corners, chasing away some of the weariness that had settled there for years. The pub buzzed around them, the murmur of distant conversations, the clink of glasses, the soft rock music from the jukebox, but in their small, secluded booth, a new silence had settled, one of quiet understanding, of cautious hope, of a future unwritten but no longer feared. They had met again after the summer of 1983, not to relive it, not to desperately cling to its fading echoes, but to acknowledge its enduring magic and to bravely step, together but independently, into an uncertain, yet newly vibrant, future. They stayed for a little longer, talking of small things, of Christmas plans, of the changes they hoped to make. There was no grand declaration, no sudden rush of passion that ignored the years between. Just a quiet, steady presence, a shared warmth that seemed to radiate from their clasped hands. When they finally stepped out into the cold December night, the air outside was sharp and biting, carrying the scent of damp pavement and distant coal fires. But for the first time in a long time, Liam felt a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the pub's fire or the whiskey he'd nursed. It was a warmth that settled deep in his chest, a quiet, insistent thrum of possibility. The possibilities, once buried under layers of resignation and fear, felt limitless again, stretching out before him like a newly unfurled map, waiting to be explored. He watched Sarah walk away, her silhouette disappearing into the hazy streetlights, and for a long moment, he just stood there, the cold air biting at his exposed skin, a faint, lingering smile playing on his lips. The quiet hum of new beginnings echoed in the sudden stillness of the night. If this story left any impression on you, or reminded you of a moment from your own life, feel free to share it in the comments. Even a small memory is enough. Stories from the past often carry meaning we only begin to understand much later. Your memory might become part of someone else's story.